Dr. Elara Vance stared at the impossible data glowing on her screen. Embedded in the DNA of a 4,000-year-old mummy was a code that shouldn't exist for another 3 millennia. A perfectly structured sequence that looked less like evolution and more like engineering. But when she followed the genetic coordinates deep into the forbidden desert, she discovered something far more terrifying than ancient aliens. The artifact wasn't from the past at all. It was from the future, and she had just set it free. The laboratory of Dr. Elara Vance was not so much a room as a statement of principle. It was a cathedral of brushed steel and sterilized glass, a place where the chaos of the natural world was tamed, catalogued, and forced to reveal its secrets. It was her sanctuary, and she was its high priestess. Tonight, as with most nights, she was holding court. On the large monitor dominating one wall, the face of a junior colleague, Ben, looked out, creased with a familiar mix of awe and frustration. "I'm telling you, Dr. Vance, the allele frequency in batch 9 is strange. It doesn't align with any known migratory pattern for the period." Elara adjusted her glasses, her expression one of immense practiced patience. She gestured to a highlighted section of the data he was sharing. "Ben," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of ambiguity, "look at your baseline checksum. It's off by 0.001%, a rounding error in the initial calibration. You've been chasing a ghost created by a sloppy setup." She leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "The data doesn't lie. It can't. But it can be tortured until it confesses to anything. Our job is not to be creative. Our job is to be clean. Stick to the protocol. The protocol is truth." Ben's face fell, then reset into dutiful acceptance. "Yes, Doctor. Of course. Rerunning calibration now. Good." She gave a curt nod. "And get some sleep. Exhaustion is a variable we can't afford." She ended the call, the screen going dark, leaving her in the quiet hum of her domain. Her own work was far more significant than Ben's calibration errors. For months, she had been entrusted with samples from one of the most enigmatic archaeological finds of the century, the Tarim Mummies. Bronze Age Caucasians discovered in Western China, their bodies preserved for 4 millennia by the dry, salt-rich air of the Taklamakan Desert. The official project, a joint effort with the Chinese government, was to map their origins, to finally draw the definitive lines of migration that brought these people to this isolated basin. For Elara, it was the ultimate data problem. Pure, clean, ancient code, just waiting to be read. She glanced at her own workstation. A new analysis was nearing completion. Sample TM07, the beauty of Loulan, they called her. The most famous of the mummies, a woman with delicate features and reddish blonde hair, so perfectly preserved she looked as though she might simply open her eyes. Elara took a sip of her long cold coffee, the bitter taste a familiar anchor in the late hours. The result would be another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation of a Eurasian haplogroup, another victory for order. A soft digital chime echoed through the lab, sequence complete. Elara turned to the screen, a flicker of routine satisfaction in her eyes. The display populated, lines of code and vibrant graphs snapping into place. She scanned the primary haplogroup data. As expected, R1A, Eastern European origin. A clean, satisfying answer. She was about to log the result and shut down for the night, when her eyes snagged on a secondary panel, a deep dive analysis of the so-called junk DNA, the vast, non-coding regions of the genome. She stopped. Her hand, midway to the mouse, froze in the air. It was impossible. There, embedded in the ancient degraded DNA of a 4,000-year-old woman, was a sequence that had no right to be there. It wasn't organic. It wasn't evolved. It was structured. It was a perfectly symmetrical repeating block of base pairs, arranged with a mathematical precision that nature never produced. It was too clean, too sharp. It had the unmistakable signature of something designed. It looked less like a gene and more like a circuit, a keyhole crafted from the building blocks of life itself, inserted into a strand of ancient code. Her mind, a fortress of logic and reason, immediately raised its defenses. Contamination, she whispered to the empty room. It had to be. A fragment of synthetic DNA from another lab, a stray bacterium, a flaw in the sequencer's optical reader. She moved with frantic precision. Her earlier calm shattered. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating a full system diagnostic. She ran a check on the sequencing plate, the reagents, the entire sterile environment. Every test came back clean. The machine was functioning perfectly. The environment was pure, fine. She would disprove it from the source. She pulled up the raw photon count data from the sequencer itself, the absolute, unfiltered, first-generation reading of the sample. Rerunning the analysis, she bypassed all the interpretive software, all the layers of processing. She was looking at the code in its most naked form. The marker was still there. Not a ghost, not an error. It was a tangible, undeniable part of the beauty of Loulan's genome, a perfect, pristine violation of biology, history, and the linear progression of time. The solid ground of her scientific worldview crumbled, plunging her into an abyss of impossibility. The quiet confidence on her face was replaced by a mask of utter disbelief, which slowly, chillingly, dissolved into a flicker of profound intellectual terror. The next morning, the data felt like a radioactive contaminant on the monitor of Director Schmidt's spacious, sunlit office. Schmidt, a man whose career was built on securing funding and avoiding controversy, stared at the impossible sequence, his brow furrowed. He was not a scientist at heart. He was a manager, and this was not manageable. "It looks like a primer fragment," he said, grasping for a familiar explanation. "A synthetic artifact from the PCR process." "I've ruled that out," Elara said, her voice tight. "The structure, the length, the integration site, it is not a process artifact. It was in her, 4,000 years ago. It's a technology that, by all rights, shouldn't exist for another 3 millennia." Schmidt ran a hand over his face. He looked from the screen to Elara, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his eyes, not of the discovery, but of its consequences. "What are you suggesting, Elara? That she was what? Genetically engineered? An ancient astronaut?" He scoffed, but the sound was hollow. Before she could answer, a sharp trill from his computer cut through the tension. A priority flagged email. He clicked it open. The seal of their official partner, the Chinese Ministry of Historical Integrity, flashed on screen. The text was brief and icily polite. "Director Schmidt," he read aloud, his voice strained. "Pursuant to Article 12, subsection C of our collaborative agreement, we have reason to believe a portion of the Tarim samples may have been compromised by localized fungal contamination prior to excavation. To ensure the integrity of the project, we are invoking our right to recall all genetic materials for independent verification. Please transfer all samples and cease any and all independent analysis immediately." Elara stared at him, incredulous. "Contamination? That's absurd. They can just..." "They can," Schmidt interrupted, his face pale. He looked at her, his expression now hard, resolute. He had chosen his side. The clause is real, buried deep in the fine print. It gives them unilateral authority over the disposition of the artifacts if they claim potential damage. "But they can't know what I found. It's impossible. I only confirmed it last night." "They don't need to know," Schmidt said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "The timing is a coincidence, a very, very unfortunate coincidence." He stood up, the meeting clearly over. "Pack up the samples, Elara. Send them everything. The raw data, your notes, all of it." "You can't be serious. This is the greatest discovery in human history. We can't let it get buried in some political archive." "Yes, we can," Schmidt said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "We can, and we will. This is above our pay grade. It's above the pay grade of this entire institute. Whatever that thing is on your screen, it is now their problem, not ours." He walked to the door, holding it open for her. Let it go. Obedience was a concept as fundamental to Elara's character as the scientific method itself. You obey the data. You obey the protocol. You obey the chain of command. For 42 years, this rigid adherence to structure had been the scaffolding of her life, the source of her success. Now, for the first time, she was about to break it. The lab, her sterile sanctuary, felt different at this hour, shrouded in a conspiratorial darkness. The only light came from her monitor, casting a ghostly blue pallor on her tense face. The command from Director Schmidt had been absolute: let it go. But the image of the synthetic gene marker was burned into her mind. It was a question that screamed for an answer, and letting it go felt like a betrayal of her entire existence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted a small, heavily encrypted drive into the workstation S port. A dialog box appeared, copying files to secure shuttle. A progress bar began its slow crawl across the screen. 1 gigabyte. The sequence itself, the raw photon counts, her diagnostic logs, every scrap of data associated with TM-07. Every tick of the clock in the silent lab sounded like a hammer blow. Every soft hum of the ventilation system felt like an approaching footstep. This was not science. This was theft, an act of rebellion against the very institution that had made her. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the lab door. Elara froze, her blood turning to ice. The silhouette of a security guard, his shape distorted and immense, paused for a moment before moving on down the corridor. Elara didn't breathe until the footsteps faded completely. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. The progress bar hit 100%. Transfer complete. She snatched the drive from the port, its metal casing warm in her clammy hand, and slipped it into her pocket. The weight of it was insignificant, but it felt as heavy as a smuggled truth. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a conspirator. If she was going to chase a ghost, she needed a ghost hunter, or in this case, someone who had already been destroyed by one. His name was Julian Croft, and he was a legend of the worst kind, a cautionary tale whispered among academics. 20 years ago, he had been a rising star in Eurasian history. Then he had published his theory about the Tarim Basin, and his career had ended overnight. Elara found him in the sub-basement of the university library, a dusty catacomb of forgotten knowledge where disgraced scholars were sent to fade into obscurity. He was surrounded by towering, precarious stacks of yellowing maps and ancient texts, a king in a crumbling paper kingdom. He looked older than his 50-some years, with a cynical slump to his shoulders and eyes that had lost their fight. She approached his table quietly. "Julian Croft?" He didn't look up from the book he was reading. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Dr. Elara Vance. I need to talk to you about anachronistic evidence in the Tarim Basin." A short, bitter laugh escaped his lips. He finally raised his head, and his gaze was weary, dismissive. "Lady, I've had conversations that start like that with people who think aliens built the pyramids and Elvis is living in an underground city in Tibet. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." He gestured vaguely at the labyrinth of shelves. "The fiction section is 2 floors up." He had been burned, and he had no intention of playing with fire again. He turned back to his book. The conversation declared over. She found him the next day at a small, dingy coffee shop near the university, nursing a single cup of black coffee as if it were a life raft. He saw her coming and sighed, a look of profound irritation on his face. "I thought I made myself clear." "You did," Elara said, sliding into the seat opposite him. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She opened her laptop and turned it to face him. On the screen, the synthetic gene marker glowed an elegant, terrifying helix of impossible code. "I'm not here to talk about theories," she said, her voice low and urgent. I'm here to show you data. Julian glanced at the screen, his professional curiosity warring with his instinct to flee. This isn't a pot shard that's in the wrong geological layer, Elara continued, pushing the laptop closer. This isn't a misplaced tool or a confusing carving. This was inside a human being 4,000 years ago. This, she tapped the screen, is a message. Julian leaned forward, his cynical armor beginning to crack. He stared at the structured, repeating patterns, the clean lines of the code. A flicker of something long dormant ignited in his eyes a memory. Without a word, he reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a tattered notebook. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing over faded pencil sketches and frantic notes. He stopped on a specific page. On it was a detailed rubbing he had taken from an artifact 2 decades ago, a strange, crystalline shard found near the original Tarim dig sites, an object that had been swiftly confiscated by Chinese authorities and officially lost in a warehouse fire. The pattern in his sketch, a series of interlocking geometric shapes, was an unmistakable, if simpler, version of the genetic structure glowing on her screen. The language she had found written in DNA, he had found written in stone. My God, Julian whispered, looking from his notebook to the screen and back again. They weren't just burying bodies, they were burying a key. Alarmed and galvanized by the connection, Elara knew she had to go back. There were supporting data sets, environmental logs from the dig site, other contextual files she had overlooked, files that might now make sense with Julian's discovery. That evening, she drove back to the Institute, her mind racing. The encrypted drive was in her pocket, but the more proof she had, the better. She strode down the familiar hallway to her lab, her steps echoing in the silence. She raised her keycard to the sensor on the door. The sensor flashed red. A short, angry buzz. Access denied. She tried again. Red. Denied. A cold dread washed over her. She peered through the thick glass of the door. The lab was not empty. Director Schmidt stood near her main workstation, his posture stiff, his face ashen. He was flanked by 2 men in identical, impeccably tailored, but utterly bland suits. They had the still, watchful quality of predators. One of them, a man with a placid, almost gentle smile, watched as a technician she'd never seen before methodically worked at her computer. She could see the screen. He wasn't analyzing data. He was running a deep format protocol, wiping everything. The man with the placid smile, Mr. Chen, looked up and met her gaze through the glass. He didn't react, didn't flinch. He simply held her stare, his gentle smile never wavering, and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of silent acknowledgement. The message was perfectly, chillingly clear. We know. Schmidt, seeing her there, flinched and turned away, refusing to meet her eye. Her lab, her data, her entire professional life, it was all being systematically, professionally, and silently executed right in front of her. And there was nothing she could do about it. The conflict was no longer academic. It was now a threat, and she was its target. Julian's apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was the physical manifestation of a 2-decade obsession. Every surface was covered. Books were stacked in towering, precarious columns that threatened to collapse under the weight of their own forgotten knowledge. Ancient maps, marked with hundreds of annotations in Julian's spidery handwriting, were pinned to the walls. Display cases held geological samples and replica artifacts. It was the fortress of a man who had lost a war with the world and had retreated to build a new one entirely within his own 4 walls. Locked out of her own lab, her official life effectively over, Elara now found herself in the heart of this academic asylum. Julian, energized for the first time since she'd met him, paced in front of a large corkboard covered in photographs of the Tarim Mummies. You have to forget what you know, what the official narrative tells you, he said, his voice thrumming with the passion of a man finally able to speak his truth to someone who might listen. They weren't just lost Indo-European traders who wandered into the desert and died. That's a neat, simple story that dismisses the evidence of organization. He pointed to a photo of the beauty of Loulan, the source of Elara's impossible gene marker. They call her a chieftain's wife. Look at her. Look at the complex weave of her clothes, the tools she was buried with. That is not ceremonial garb. It's a uniform. Those aren't trinkets. They're instruments. He swept his arm across the board, indicating different mummies, different sites. This wasn't a civilization. It was an installation, a purpose-built society of guardians, technicians, and watchers, placed in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth for a single reason: to monitor a locus, a site of immense, anomalous energy. He stopped and looked at Elara, his eyes burning with conviction. I proposed that 20 years ago. I suggested that the Tarim people represented a technologically organized, specialized society in the Bronze Age. They laughed me out of every university from Oxford to Beijing. They said I was seeing patterns where there was only chaos. Elara looked from Julian's intense face to the glowing screen of her laptop, where the perfectly ordered, impossibly advanced genetic code was displayed. You weren't seeing patterns, she said softly. You were seeing the truth. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted from lecture to a frantic, collaborative workshop. The hours bled into one another, fueled by stale coffee and the electrifying thrill of discovery. Elara projected the 3D model of the synthetic gene onto a dusty whiteboard, its complex structure turning slowly in the dim light. "It's an algorithm," she murmured, tracing its interlocking helices with her finger. In bioinformatics, we see sequences that act as switches, turning other genes on or off. But this is different. It doesn't interact with any other part of the genome. It is self-contained. It is not a switch. It's a key. Julian, energized, grabbed one of his old maps and taped it to the wall next to the whiteboard. A key to what? He then overlaid a transparent sheet covered in his own sketches of the lost artifact. The geometric patterns from the stone slotted into the gaps of the DNA model like a missing piece of a puzzle. "They aren't just similar," he breathed. "They're part of a single design." He started pointing out constellations, ancient trade routes, magnetic anomalies, his life's work. The ancients navigated by the stars. What if the map isn't on the ground? What if it's in the sky? That was the trigger. Elara's mind, trained to see data in everything, made the leap. She began cross-referencing the base pair sequences of the gene, the A, T, C, and G, with Julian's astronomical data. It was a painstaking, maddening process. Adenine as an azimuth, guanine as an elevation. It was a code that spanned two completely different scientific languages. And then it unlocked. A string of numbers emerged from the chaos, a set of precise geographical coordinates. Elara typed them into a satellite mapping program. The maps zoomed in on the vast, empty expanse of the Taklamakan Desert. The coordinates pointed to a single, tiny blind spot, a digital void where no satellite coverage existed, deep inside a restricted military zone. They stared at the screen, the blinking cursor a beacon in the digital darkness. They were no longer reacting to a mystery. They were chasing it. They had a destination. Far away, in a sleek, sterile office, high above the glittering lights of Beijing, the mystery was not a quest for truth, but a matter of asset management. Director Lin of the Ministry of Historical Integrity stood at attention, her posture ramrod straight. Before her, a floor-to-ceiling screen displayed not a face, but the stylized logo of a global corporation, and a flat pulsing line that represented a voice. "The geneticist, Vance, has made contact with the historian, Croft," Lin reported, her voice betraying no emotion. "They have sequestered themselves. We believe they are attempting to decipher the marker." The digitally disguised voice that answered was calm, but the calmness was more menacing than any shout. "Our investment in that region is generational, Director. This anomaly is a resource, not a revelation. It is a technological asset, not a historical curiosity. Its discovery would destabilize markets, upend global power structures. The narrative we have spent 50 years building must be protected. My orders were to contain the data, Lynn stated. Your orders have been updated, the voice replied, its tone dropping. This has escalated beyond containment. Resolve this situation. Personally. See to it that this inquiry ends permanently. A week later, Elara and Julian were ghosts of their former selves, swallowed by the vibrant, chaotic crush of the Kashgar market. Disguised as backcountry tourists, clad in hiking gear that felt like a costume, they moved through the throng of sellers, spies, and soldiers that populated the tense capital of the Xinjiang region. The air was thick with the scent of spices and the palpable feeling of being watched. Surveillance cameras perched on every corner, and plainclothes officers moved through the crowds with an unnerving purpose. They found their man in a tea house, a Uyghur guide named Kale, with eyes that had seen 1,000 desert sunrises and a face that gave away nothing. Julian laid out a map, pointing to the general area of the restricted zone. Kale glanced at it, then at them. He named a price that was twice the going rate. No questions, he said, his voice a low rumble. They agreed without haggling. As they loaded supplies, water, fuel, food into Kale's rugged, beat-up jeep, Elara felt a familiar cold prickle on the back of her neck. She scanned the crowded square, her heart beginning to pound, and then she saw him. Across the bustling expanse, standing partially obscured by a spice vendor's stall, was Mr. Chen, the man from her lab. He wasn't trying to hide. He was simply watching them, that same serene, placid smile on his face. He made no move to intercept them, no signal to the nearby police. He just watched. The smile was the message. This wasn't a chase. They weren't fugitives who had cleverly escaped. They were being allowed to run. The leash had been loosened, just enough for them to lead their hunters directly to the prize. Kyle started the engine, and the jeep roared to life, lurching out of the market and onto the road that led into the endless, waiting desert. The world dissolved into a shimmering haze of heat and sand. The Taklamakan Desert, the Sea of Death, was not an empty place. It was a place of profound and aggressive absence. It actively worked to unmake you, to strip away your water, your sense of direction, your very will to continue. For 3 days, they drove into its heart, the jeep a tiny, rattling speck in a vast, indifferent landscape. For Elara, a creature of climate-controlled labs and ordered data, it was a special kind of hell. The sun was a physical weight, the wind a constant scouring pad against her skin. Every part of her ached. But as she faded, Julian seemed to come alive. He was no longer a disgraced academic hiding in a basement. He was a chronicler, a historian connected to the very land they crossed. He would point to a distant, crumbling ruin and tell stories of the Silk Road merchants who had sheltered there 1,000 years before. He read the landscape like a text, finding meaning in the shape of a dune or the color of a rock. Their guide, Kyle, remained mostly silent, a man who spoke the desert's own language of signs and survival, his competence a quiet reassurance in the rattling jeep. On the 4th day, the sky turned a bruised yellow. A sandstorm descended upon them, a roaring, suffocating wall of grit that reduced the world to a few feet of swirling chaos. Kyle expertly maneuvered the jeep into the lee of a large rock outcropping, and for hours they huddled together, the world outside screaming. In that shared claustrophobic silence, the last of the friction between Elara and Julian burned away. They were no longer just a scientist and a historian. They were two people clinging to a single desperate hope, stripped of everything but their mutual reliance. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world scoured clean under a sky of impossible clarity, something between them had settled. They were partners. On the 5th day, Kale pointed to the horizon. "We are here." They crested a high dune and looked down upon the coordinates. Julian's face fell. There were no ancient ruins, no crumbling temple walls, no sign of the Bronze Age society he had spent his life imagining. Below them lay the skeletal remains of something far more recent, a collection of crumbling concrete blockhouses and rusted watchtowers, half buried in the sand, arranged in a stark geometric pattern. It was an abandoned military base, Soviet era by the look of it. "I was wrong," Julian said, the words heavy with 2 decades of resurrected and recrushed hope. "It's nothing, just another Cold War relic." Elara didn't answer. She was staring at the layout of the decaying buildings, a strange, cold chill of recognition prickling at the back of her neck. The pattern was familiar. She frantically dug her laptop from her bag, shielding it from the sun. She pulled up the 3D model of the synthetic gene marker, the impossible code from the beauty of Loulan. She held the laptop up, comparing the image on the screen to the sprawling complex below. The blockhouses, the central command building, the connecting access roads. It was all there. A perfect, scaled-up, 3-dimensional replica of the genetic structure. "Julian," she breathed, her voice trembling. He looked at her, saw the look on her face, and then followed her gaze from the laptop to the base and back again. The color drained from his face. "It wasn't a map to this place," Elara whispered in horrified awe. "It's a blueprint for it." The paradox hung in the air, a concept so vast and terrifying it threatened to shatter reality itself. A 4,000-year-old gene contained the architectural plans for a 20th century Soviet outpost. Causality was a joke, time was a loop. They descended into the silent, dead facility, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. Kyle remained with the jeep, his unease palpable. "This place is cursed," was all he said. They found an entrance easily enough, a heavy steel blast door leading down into the earth, left ajar as if in a hurry. The air that rose to meet them was cold, still, and sterile. The bunker was a time capsule of Cold War paranoia. They moved through labs filled with decayed Soviet equipment, dusty chalkboards covered in frantic, half-erased equations. But here and there, they saw something else. Technology that was far too advanced, integrated seamlessly with the older hardware. It was a place of jarring contradictions. Finally, they reached the heart of the bunker, a large, circular chamber. And there it was. Suspended in the center of the room within a crackling containment field was a large crystalline artifact. It was a lattice of impossibly complex, interlocking shapes, pulsing with a faint, soft, internal light. It seemed to inhale and exhale, and the air around it shimmered with a strange energy. This was the locus. This was Julian's impossible theory made real. They stared, mesmerized, a scientist and a historian gazing upon something that defied both of their disciplines. The moment of awe was shattered by a sudden, deafening snap. Blinding floodlights erupted from the ceiling, plunging them from darkness into harsh, sterile light. They flinched back, their eyes watering. From the shadows surrounding the chamber, figures emerged, soldiers, clad in black tactical gear, their weapons leveled. And at their head, a woman with an air of absolute authority and a face like sculpted ice. Director Lin. 2 soldiers dragged a struggling Kyle into the chamber, throwing him to his knees at her feet. "This is not history, Dr. Vance," Lin said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber, devoid of all warmth. "This is a quarantine." She gestured to the softly glowing artifact. "The mummies you are so fascinated by? They were not guardians. They were the first victims. A failed experiment in integrating this technology with organic matter." She took a step forward, her eyes locking onto Elara's. "Your entire investigation has been predicated on a false assumption. You are looking for something from the past." "You are wrong." Lin paused, letting the weight of her final words land with the force of a physical blow. "This artifact is not ancient. We believe it is from the future." The detention room was a simple concrete box, stripped of anything but cold, oppressive silence. Julian sat on the floor, his head in his hands, defeated, Elara paced, her mind a whirlwind, trying to process the sheer, paradigm-shattering scale of Director Lin's revelation. An artifact from the future, a wound in time. The heavy steel door hissed open. Director Lin entered, alone. 2 soldiers remained outside. She ignored Julian completely, her focus entirely on Elara. "You have seen the anomaly, Dr. Vance," Lin began, her voice as clipped and precise as a scalpel. "You, better than anyone, can appreciate the scale of it. It is the single greatest discovery or incursion in human history." She began to circle Elara slowly. "Uncontrolled, it is a paradox that could unravel the fabric of causality. It could erase us all. But controlled studied it, could offer advancements you can barely dream of. Unlimited energy, the reversal of aging, the very secrets of time itself." She stopped directly in front of Elara. "You are a scientist. You believe in data, in knowledge. You understand that knowledge is power. I am offering you a choice. Join us. Your expertise in genetics, in understanding its code, would be invaluable. You would have unlimited access, a seat at the table where the next chapter of human history will be written." The offer was a poisoned chalice, but the chalice was filled with the most intoxicating drink imaginable. Every fiber of Elara's being, every part of her that had dedicated her life to the pursuit of knowledge, screamed at her to accept. "And if I refuse?" Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Director Lin's expression did not change, but a cold finality entered her eyes. "Then you and Mr. Croft are a loose end. A regrettable one. You will become a forgotten footnote, a tragic story of 2 academics who got lost in the desert, a history that no one will ever read." Elara looked at Julian, then back at Lin. She saw in Lin's eyes a dark reflection of herself, the same ruthless dedication to a goal, the same belief that the ends justified the means. It was the precipice of her own potential corruption. She had to choose between knowing the secrets of the universe and protecting the universe from them. "I'll do it," Elara said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'll help you." A thin, triumphant smile touched Lin's lips. Back in the artifact chamber, the air was thick with energy. The great crystal pulsed with a soft, hypnotic light, a captured star breathing in the dark. Lin's scientists, a mix of nervous physicists and engineers, scurried around diagnostic consoles. Elara was led to a primary terminal, its screen displaying a stream of complex energy metrics. "The field is unstable," one of the scientists said to Lin. "It's reacting to the increased biosignatures in the room. It seems to resonate with organic DNA." Elara's eyes darted to the control interface on her screen. The command structure, the programming logic. It was instantly terrifyingly familiar. It was a more complex version, but it used the same foundational principles as the gene lock she had discovered in the mummy. The key and the lock, together at last. She knew, with chilling certainty, how this machine thought. She had her opening. "The field harmonics are oscillating out of phase," Elara said suddenly, her voice sharp with authority, pointing to a meaningless graph. "You're getting quantum tunneling across the containment boundary. You need to recalibrate the tertiary plasma injectors, or you'll get a cascade failure." The lead scientist, flustered by this sudden, confident command from the world-renowned geneticist, turned to argue. Director Lin, seeing a potential problem with her prize, took a step toward them, her attention diverted for a critical few seconds. It was all Elara needed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't attacking the system. She wasn't trying to cause an overload. She was doing something far more fundamental. She was inputting the release command, the sequence that told the lock it was finally home. She was unlocking the safeties. "Julian, run!" she screamed. A single, piercing chime echoed through the chamber, a sound of acceptance. The artifact's soft glow vanished, replaced by a violent, blinding flare of pure white light. The steady hum of the containment field became a deafening shriek. Reality itself began to warp at the edges of the room, the walls seeming to shimmer and bend. The alarms blared, a panicked, Futile warning. Director Lin spun around, her face a mask of horrified realization as she saw the simple, elegant command on Elara's screen. Safeties disengaged. Protocol released. She screamed at her soldiers, but her voice was swallowed by the rising crescendo of power. The quarantine was broken. The wound in time had just been torn wide open. Elara grabbed Julian, pulling him toward a service corridor they passed on the way in. Behind them, the world was dissolving into pure energy. They scrambled into the narrow tunnel, a desperate flight through darkness as the bunker tore itself apart around them. Concrete groaned and metal screamed. They burst out of an emergency exit and onto the desert surface, just as a deep, primal tremor shook the very bedrock beneath their feet. They turned and watched. The ground above the bunker, an area the size of a city block, simply collapsed inward. It fell into itself, creating a massive, swirling crater of sand and rock. A colossal pillar of dust and displaced air erupted into the dawn sky, a funeral pyre for the impossible. Then, silence descended once more upon the desert, absolute and complete. The artifact, the bunker, Director Lin and her soldiers were gone, buried under millions of tons of sand, their secret erased from the world. Julian helped a shaking, soot-stained Elara to her feet. She clutched the satchel that held her laptop, her one remaining tie to her old life. She pulled out the encrypted drive, the smuggled truth she had risked everything for, and plugged it into the machine. The screen remained dark. The drive was dead, its complex circuitry fried by the immense energy surge. All of it, the data, the logs, the coordinates, the proof, was gone. They had survived, but they had nothing. 1 year later, a full lecture hall at a prestigious university listened, rapt. Julian Croft stood at the podium, no longer a broken man in a dusty basement, but a respected, reinstated professor, his eyes alight with a new kind of wisdom. The title of his guest lecture was Myth as Historical Data, Re-evaluating Suppressed Narratives. In the back row, Elara watched, a small, quiet smile on her face. She was no longer Dr. Vance, the pragmatist who lived by the cold, hard numbers. She was a woman who had seen the numbers fall apart. A young student in the front row raised his hand. "Professor Croft," he asked, "it's a fascinating theory, but where is the proof?" It was the question that had once defined Elara's entire world, the question she would have asked herself. Julian smiled, and his eyes found Elara's across the crowded room. "Empirical proof tells us what happened," he said, his voice resonating with a gentle authority. "It cannot always tell us what it meant. Some truths are not artifacts to be analyzed. They are testimonies to be heard." He held Elara's gaze. "We must learn to listen." Elara smiled back, a quiet, complete acknowledgement. She had listened. She had learned. The proof was gone, but the truth remained. And now she was its guardian. What a fascinating journey this story takes us on. It's not just a thriller about a hidden truth. It's a deep dive into the nature of proof itself. At the beginning, Dr. Elara Vance exists in a world of comforting certainty, where every mystery can be solved with the right data and protocol. Her entire identity is built on the idea that truth is something you can measure, verify, and print in a report. But the story brilliantly strips that certainty away. It forces her out of the clean room and into a world where the lines between hard science, suppressed history, and what some might call myth completely dissolve. The most compelling part is the choice she makes at the end. She doesn't just lose the evidence of the artifact. She actively chooses to destroy it. She sacrifices the ultimate scientific prize, the greatest data set in human history, to prevent it from being controlled and weaponized. It suggests that sometimes the most ethical scientific act isn't discovery, but containment. The story leaves us in a fascinating place, arguing that some truths are too vast or too dangerous for spreadsheets and peer review. They can only be carried as testimony, passed down as stories. So that brings me to the question for you. If you discovered a truth that was world-changing but also incredibly dangerous, would your instinct be to prove it to the world, or to protect the world by burying it forever?